Welcome to Wisdom for Life, where we sift through philosophy to find practical advice that you can use in your everyday life. Hi, I'm Dan Hayes, and I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Greg Sadler. Today we're talking about
philosophical ideas that people get mixed up. And this is sort of a continuation of our episode that we did last time, where we were looking at philosophical terms and how they've changed over the years so that there's like a original meaning of, say, Epicureanism or Stoicism or skepticism. And then there's what people make of it today. And we promised that we were going to get to what you could call philosophical concepts or tropes or constructs or ideas like Aristotle's virtuous mean or Occam's razor, because we have the same problem that occurs with these. There's a lot of people who use these terms and maybe they're not completely clear about what the terms mean in an original or more rigorous way. And, we're not here to bust anyone's chops like we talked about last time. We're not saying that these are the only ways that you can talk about it. So obviously, if you want to bring up Descartes' cogito or philosophies, footnotes to Plato, or any of these things in a casual conversation, or as one of my professors this shows you how out of touch he was, he used to say, you can use these ideas at your cocktail parties that you go to. And we were all like, cocktail parties? Where do you think we go? What kind of life do you think we live? But apparently there's still professors out there who talk in those terms about going to cocktail parties. I mean, I've been to a few cocktail parties at ritzy events. Dan, have you been to cocktail parties where you chit-chat about ideas or current affairs?
If only, like the closest things to cocktail parties were things that I might have done in college, but the onus was more on drinking than it was in the actual ideas.
and cocktails there might not have been actual cocktails from the bar, but rather cups of beer from a keg, right?
Oh, well, I was part of a group that had a weekly cocktail party where there was a specific cocktail. Yes.
That's always fun. That's kind of cool to do. Yeah.
It was like, hey, we're going to have a cocktail of the week. It's, and we're going to dress up and like be a little bit fancy. So it really was at least the trappings of a cocktail party. The conversation could have used a little bit.
I think, at least for college students, that's a bona fide cocktail party. You're putting in some effort. It's an occasion.
Yes.
Before we get into our ideas, so what would you guys talk about at these parties?
So part of it was just have an excuse to have a date.
Okay.
And so it's like, you'd find someone, hey, you want to go to a fancy cocktail party and whatnot? We'll get dressed up. They get dressed up. You have a reason to get dressed up and do that. Yes, it did start off with cocktails until the cocktail mixings were done. And then, it would be a retirement to the basement bar where, more, college experience would happen.
Yeah, we usually had the bar, because I didn't go to a place quite as fancy as UW-Madison. The bar would be like in the same room, and they would just start bringing out other things. But so let's come back to the topic. So, as I was mentioning, we're not trying to bust anybody's chops. We're going to try to avoid the dichotomy of ivory tower educated versus ordinary people. But it can be helpful sometimes to know what the actual saying or idea is, especially if you're going to talk about it with people who do know what they are. And I thought a great place to start would be with this quote that you see all the time getting invoked. Philosophy is just a set of footnotes to Plato. And this comes from Alfred North Whitehead, probably his most famous and most difficult book, Process and Reality. And, the idea I think that a lot of people get from hearing that is, well, Plato articulated all the major ideas in Western philosophy. Everybody else has just been kind of doing variations after that. I'm actually, before we talk about what Whitehead actually meant, I mean, have you run into this idea or quip or quote in the past?
I have, but I don't know. Maybe this was more popular, maybe before the deconstructionists, philosophies or existentialism, where you're like really, there seems to be some new ideas in the last 100 years that seem to be very outside in the Western philosophy than Plato. But as we said, like that, there's so many of the basics of just like doing inquiry that from Plato's writings on Socrates that you have to start there if you want to know what the hell's going on.
Yeah, Plato's a good starting point, and I'm not knocking his dialogues, and Whitehead liked his dialogues too. But in that passage where he like brought so it's one of those things where somebody throws out an idea, they don't really mean it. It's a really great catchphrase, and then they like take it back within the same paragraph. So he said, I'm alluding to the wealth of general ideas scattered through Plato's works, his personal endowments, his wide opportunities for experience at a great period of civilization, his inheritance of an intellectual tradition not yet stiffened by excessive systematization have made his writings an inexhaustible mine of suggestion. And so, we can, if we use that mine metaphor, we can dig into Plato's writings and pull out nuggets that are useful. But Whitehead doesn't think that like every key idea, in philosophy was already there in Plato's works. I mean, some of the ones that we're going to look at in just a minute, like Aristotle's virtuous mean, not there in Plato,
Right.
So it's, it's a new contribution, or the dichotomy of control that we'll look at a bit later as well. So even in the ancient period, Plato's a heavy hitter. You definitely don't want to skip him. It'd be a bad idea to say, oh, I'm just going to read Aristotle, or I'm just going to read the Stoics and not read Plato at all. But is all philosophy just footnotes to Plato? No,
I feel like because he's so early and formal and has such a wide breadth that, the whole idea of philosophy being a conversation over centuries, that, you could take it one step more and say like, oh, yeah, everything's footnotes to Aristotle because, like there's so much dialogue that happens after that that builds off that or is trying to counter something that it says that like, it's part of the greater conversation. He's just this kind of monolith at the beginning, and the corpus is really large.
Yeah, and it's interesting you bring up like conversation, because in Plato's dialogue, so they're conversations to begin with, right? Usually imaginary. But he has, he sort of places the people in the dialogue in conversation with much earlier thinkers like Parmenides or Heraclitus or Democritus, people that have died and disappeared by the time that Plato's writing. So it's kind of a cool idea, this notion of philosophy is this ongoing conversation. And you're right, Plato is really important for creating the opportunities for that ongoing conversation. I was thinking too, and I don't want to spend too much time on this. I think you're right. We could say footnotes to Aristotle, like we say footnotes to Plato, and then who else in the history of philosophy has that much centrality and importance? I mean, you wouldn't say, well, all of philosophy is footnotes to René Descartes.
Right.
He didn't write enough for that to be the case. Or all of philosophy is footnotes to Immanuel Kant. So he did write a lot, but that wouldn't make sense, right?
So, time and size.
Yeah. Well, you want to talk about the next one?
Oh, yeah. So Occam's razor here, aka the principle of parsimony or the law of parsimony. And so, obviously, who is Occam? Well, Occam is a medieval philosopher by the name of William of Occam. But this same idea, at least in a similar format, can also be found from Thomas Aquinas. And so the common usage of it is like the simplest explanation is the best or truest explanation, but this is not exactly that thing. So what did William of Occam actually say? He said the plurality must never be posited without necessity. And this is from his theological works on the sentences of Peter Lombard. The classic formulation of entities must not be multiplied beyond necessity is not actually from Occam's work, so this is just like a slightly different version, understanding of this. So what's your thought there?
Well, I mean, entities must not be multiplied beyond necessity. I mean, that's something you can really work with. And when I explain this to my students, I'll do some sort of like, I guess you could call them thought experiments. I'll say, okay, so imagine that we've got some sort of phenomenon that we need to explain. An entity is something that exists. So how many things do you need to say are happening or existing or doing something causally in order to make it work? And this is where, sometimes the simplest explanation could, in fact, be the best one. You don't need that. I mean, so think about like explaining how alcohol works when you drink it, right? You don't need to postulate, even though people talk about demon rum, you don't need to postulate that spirits refer to like spiritual entities that somehow get stuck out in the bottle, and when you drink it, they enter into your brain and make you do dumb stuff. You could just say, well, hey, it's a drug. It has these effects. It's altering your brain chemistry, and that's why you do and say stupid things when you drink this stuff. But you don't want to try to reduce it too far. So you don't want a neuroscience of alcohol that says, well, it just like, it goes in there and it like pokes the neurons and it pokes them in a certain way. I mean, that's a simple explanation, but it's clearly not a good explanation. You got to explain how the chemicals interact with each other. Maybe there's quite a few entities involved in that. And, we could, anything you want. How does rain work? I mean, that's a pretty complicated matter.
Well, it's Zeus taking a shower, of course.
Yeah, or the angels peeing on us or something like that, right?
But this is it's a very good what we call rule of thumb, right? It's a heuristic. When you're trying to understand something, you have potentially a number of different candidate reasons for it to do, and usually the fewer needed predecessors, antecedents, are better, but that doesn't always mean that there's not a number of things that are working together. It's just kind of like, as it says, don't try to multiply the necessity, how did he put
entities
it here?
Beyond necessity, yeah.
Yeah. So you try to scrape them. It's kind of like say if you're trying to do a scientific experiment, you try to hold all variables equal except for the one that you're testing. So you try to figure out which ones are actually going to change the outcome instead of it could have been these 12 things. Okay, we're going to hold 11 of them stable as much as possible and see if that one does. If it doesn't do anything, well, then that's not one of the actual necessary prerequisites for this thing's changing.
Yeah. Umberto Eco actually has some interesting remarks about Occam's razor and these different formulations. And he says, so if you need 43 entities to adequately explain something, you better not reduce it to 42, because then you're not going to get the full explanation. But you don't need 44, 45, or however many. And I think that's a good way to think about it. I think some people go overboard in always wanting to seek out the simplest explanations because of this misrepresentation. There's something about being able to call it Occam's razor that, what would you call it, warrants people to do that, So, and, you could think about how this plays out in personal life. somebody comes home and they smell like somebody else's perfume or cologne, what's the simplest explanation? They're cheating on you. Well, there may be all sorts of other things that happen. You probably don't need to jump to that conclusion so quickly, right?
Right. And there's another reason. There's probably another of other things. Is like, why are you jumping to that conclusion? What maybe in your background, did you have someone else cheat on you? Is that why you're jumping into that? Or your partner's actually already done that in the past, and so it's like, well, that's maybe a pattern.
That is actually a great point. I imagine that a lot of people who jump into a simple explanation, there's a lot of stuff going on in the background that makes it a simple explanation for them, but maybe to an outside objective observer, they're like, yeah, I don't see that in this phenomena right here,
Right. And sometimes, crazy occurrences do happen. And just because it's the simplest, it doesn't mean that it's the true.
So this is a good segue in a way into our next thing, because Aristotle, who we're going to talk about in a minute, he defines chance in one of his works, I think it's the Metaphysics, as causes that we don't understand coming together in complicated ways. And that's the reality of the universe that we live in. We usually only get like a little tiny window into what's happening. So Aristotle's very famous for having come up with something that we referenced earlier, the golden mean, it's often called in ethics. And the idea is that, you want to be virtuous, and virtue is itself a mean, and it gets misrepresented. Or if we want to play off of the Occam, it gets oversimplified into people saying anything that's in the middle is the good thing, is the right thing to do. So, you should use heroin, but just in a moderate amount, And Aristotle would say, no, there's no right amount of heroin. You don't want to be doing that, or crystal meth or something like that. So, what Aristotle said is actually more complicated, but also more robust. He said that you do want, the virtuous thing is in between excess, too much, and deficiency, too little. So it's kind of like Goldilocks, just right. And it's not just the right amount, though. It also involves the right time, the right way or manner, the right person, the right reason. So, for example, Aristotle says that sometimes you should get angry, and you should get angry to the right amount. Don't go flying off the handle and kill everybody in the room, but don't be totally unaffected by things either. But you also do have to have it directed at the right person. You have to have the right motivation for it. And so, these feed into the mean as a habit, as something that we form through doing the right thing over and over again, or the wrong thing over and over again in the case of developing vices. And they have to be chosen. They reflect our character over time. So you can't just take any old thing and be like, how often should I go to Las Vegas and blow all my money on the slots? Aristotle would say, don't do that at all. There isn't a right amount of that, right? And there's actually some things that Aristotle comes straight out and says, there is no right amount of these because they're wrong in and of themselves. And some of them are actions like murdering people, or committing adultery. There's no moderate amount of committing adultery. It's just wrong. And then he also says this with emotions. There's certain emotional states that are just not good, like envy, for example. So you don't have like a right amount of envy versus like too much or too little. Whatever amount you've got is too much. And I think a lot of people get mixed up about this. And one of the ways they get mixed up about it is a little bit meta or reflexive. They'll be like, well, you should be virtuous, but not too virtuous. You want to be a moderate amount of virtue. And if Aristotle were to hear that, he'd be like, no, dummy, that's not what I'm saying at all, So there isn't like a virtuous mean of virtue itself. And there's not like a right amount of vice either. Oh, little bit of vice is good for you. No, it's vice, right? Yeah. So I think a lot of people get mixed up about this, and I do see it with my students in ethics classes. They latch on to that. It's just whatever's in the middle. So like, cheating on my significant other, if I just cheat on him a little bit, that's actually a good thing, keeps the relationship alive. And you're like, no, that you shouldn't be cheating at all.
I think that, an example with like courage is kind of because at least the way he talks about it is you're either foolhardy on one side or you're a coward on the other side. Yeah. And so if you don't want, neither of these are the good. It's not like a virtue versus vicious. It's a taking virtue to a negative place, like you're overcommitting in such a way that's like not actually going to get the goals that you want or the actually allow you to do the virtue in the future. So in the case of courage, he says like, hey, there's someone besieging your town. You are part of the guard, so it's good for you to defend the city. If you're going to run out by yourself and attack 300 people, that's probably foolhardy. You're going to get slaughtered. There's nothing going to. You're going to be throwing your life away. Hey, you're super courageous. Good for you. But it's not actually good. And also, you don't ought not to go hide under your kitchen table in your house when all of the other people in the guard are there on the walls to defend yourselves. The mean in this is not to be foolhardy, not to be brash, and not to be a coward, but to be courageous in a way that actually has a chance of being beneficial. And
that's right. Yeah, that's a great way to put it. I mean, and there are things that are like genuine virtues like that. I mean, Aristotle, one of the things I like about him is he even talks about like good humor, right? A person should like to joke around and, be able to respond to other people joking around, but there's like limits on it. You don't want to be joking around at a funeral in the receiving line. That's an inappropriate circumstance. And you don't want to, Aristotle actually says one of the guidelines for it is your jokes aren't aimed at like hurting people, making other people the butt of humor to get a laugh, but you don't want to be humorless either. That's not good, according to Aristotle. And so the golden mean is, or whatever you want to call it. I mean, it doesn't have to be golden. I think people just like calling things golden rule, golden mean, golden sayings. There's something about that people really enjoy. But the mean, the virtuous mean, it is really helpful, but you can't just apply it to anything you like. And there's probably some things it doesn't have anything to do with. How much do you read in a day? People always ask me like, how many hours do you spend reading? Or how many pages do you read? I'm like, I don't know. I mean, each day is different than the rest. It's not like I have like an average amount and I shoot for that, right? I don't think that would be very productive.
Yeah, that seems to be, there's certain places in social media that definitely like, you have to be reading at least 2 hours a day, and there's these like tropes of like you're not a good reader if you're not like doing a book a week or 2 books a week or something like that, and it just seems to be very much a kind of like this corrosive, trying to weed out who's in or out.
I think you're right. I think it does have to do with like group dynamics. It also reflects a misunderstanding of what happens when you read not just philosophy, but let's say classic literature in general. Great historical works, drama, literature. You should be like spending time on it and lingering over it. You can't like speed run through a Platonic dialogue. If you do, you're not going to get what's going on.
I was thinking Hegel's phenomenology is like, you're not going to get through that in a week.
There are people who try to speed run through that, believe it or not. But even like reading Shakespeare, I mean, it's really rich and rewarding and dense. So if you're like, I read through Macbeth in 2 hours, well, I don't know how much you got out of it then, you know?
Got the basic plot, maybe.
Yeah, some lines that you can repeat, you know, at your cocktail parties, right?
Exactly. Yeah, so you get your book of quotes, and you're just like, oh yes, this was quite illuminating.
Yeah, but don't let anyone know when you're doing that you're reading them out of a book of quotes, or they're not going to take you seriously. You got to have them stored up here, or maybe written on your hand or something.
Smart glasses that will just display them in front of you in the future.
Oh yeah.
Or actually, the future is now.
It would be a new application way back when Google was bringing out Google Glass. Mm-hmm. People got called glass holes because of wearing them, and I think it was partly a class envy sort of thing. Look at these rich people who are walking around with it, but they were also bumping into people and kind of being oblivious, sort of like people on their phones. And so this would be a whole new level of glass holery, I guess you could say.
Sure. Heck, I was on the train today, and I spent several hours of it in VR. So.
Oh, did you really?
Yeah. Well, they put out a new update for the MetaQuest that actually allows you to do that. Before, anytime you accelerated, it was a change in acceleration. So the jerk function, it threw it all just out of whack.
Interesting. Yeah.
So. Let's go to Sartre's Hell's Other People. Yeah. So, I obviously is from Jean-Paul Sartre, and his play No Exit. The misrepresentation is Sartre thinks that existence with other people is literally hellish. But what it's actually said was the character Garcin, trapped in hell eternally with two other characters, Inez and Estelle, voices this sentiment. So Sartre does present human relationships as often marked by conflict, desire of other people, objectification of the other, bad faith, but he doesn't make a sweeping claim that hell is other people. So this is a extension of his philosophy, as most of the existentialists, both especially him and Camus, wrote plays and literary books that were trying to encapsulate some of these existentialist ideas and put them into a more digestible medium than a straight philosophical text. And yes, these three people are stuck in kind of purgatory, whatever you want to call it, and they can leave. But
no, they can't leave. That's part of it. They're stuck with each other, and they're all jerks.
Yes.
They can't not be jerks, I think. They can't change as people, right? And have some sort of connection. So Sartre populated this, was it a fancy sitting room or something like that? Mm-hmm. And there's a servant who comes in every once in a while. He can go in and out, but they can't get out of it. He populates it with three people who are going to be jerks to each other the whole time. So they are hell to each other. But this isn't saying that every single human relationship is like that. I mean, if Sartre thought that, then why did he stay with Simone de Beauvoir basically his whole life? Or her with him, So.
Right. It's not... It's this interplay of, I guess, bad character traits and how we interact. And we have this desire to have a connection with people, even when those people are not good for us.
Yeah, and now that I think about it, in that play, each of the characters is trying to not only relate to the other characters. Inez maybe a little bit less, because she's like, I am a bastard. I am a terrible person. But they want some sort of acknowledgement, or what do we call it? Not verification, but you're getting something from the other person that says, hey, I get you. I accept something about you. Validation. Yeah, not verification, but validation. And they just can't get it. But they're also the kind of people that are kind of scumbags. So why would anybody give it to them? You know? I mean, it's interesting because you brought up existentialism. I think somebody else who similarly gets too often identified with his characters is Fyodor Dostoevsky.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's this line, and it's not exactly right. If God doesn't exist, then everything is permitted, right? And Ivan Karamazov seems to say something kind of like that. In that, but is Ivan Karamazov the character, Dostoevsky the author? It doesn't look that way. And yet, people will do that. Or they'll say Shakespeare thinks, blah, blah, blah. And, you know, which of Shakespeare's characters is Shakespeare? None of them, you know? So if you're writing a play or a novel or a short story, you are putting words in the characters' mouths, but that's not necessarily your ideas.
Mm-hmm. I guess. Ow.
Yeah. Did you have a particular thought or objection?
I just got stuck in my craw that like my strong recollection at the end of the movie is that they can physically leave, but
there might be a movie adaptation like that. In the original play, they can't leave.
Okay.
You know.
But like, they stay, or he stays because he can't live without them either. Like, even though they're driving each other crazy, there's that pull and push.
That's true. That is in there. But I don't think they can't get out, unless I'm totally misremembering it. You know. But so let's talk about another one. So this is one that comes up a lot in ethics and in other areas. People will say you can't get an ought from an is. And this is called Hume's law or Hume's guillotine. So it's associated with this modern philosopher, David Hume. And I guess you could say it gets used as kind of a gotcha in debates between people. They're like, you derived an ought from a bunch of is premises, or another way of describing it is you can't get value judgments from facts, or you can't go from descriptive statements to prescriptive ones. And I mean, it's not technically wrong to say that, but it's a little bit more complicated. So here's what Hume actually said. So it is clearly about ethics. In every system of morality which I've hitherto met with, I've always remarked, I'm surprised to find that instead of the usual copulations, putting together, of propositions is and is not, I meet with no proposition that is not connected with an ought or an ought not. This change is imperceptible, but is, however, of the last consequence, for as this ought or ought not expresses some new relation or affirmation, it's necessary, it should be observed and explained, and at the same time a reason should be given for what seems altogether inconceivable, how this new relation can be a deduction from others which are entirely different from it. So you could say that what he's noting is that in actual discussions, when people are trying to say this is the way we ought to behave, or human beings should be like this, or ought to behave in this way, people will start out with a bunch of factual statements like, well, they're married, so therefore they should be faithful to each other. And you can be like, well, I mean, from the mere fact that they're married, that doesn't seem to follow. But the right thing to do in that case is to say, as we did a little bit earlier, okay, what are you assuming? What background information is being rolled in that we expect everybody to have? So, people are getting married. What is a marriage? It's some sort of commitment or ceremony, and it includes these normative aspects to it. Okay, well, there's your oughts, right? It just, you weren't making it clear at the very beginning. Or, But
I guess you'd have to also add in like that these people also, buy into those normative expectations of marriage in the same way. and that they also want to do that, I guess.
And notice that those are actually is statements, right? So you're right. In any assertion that you make, there's probably not like just one or two background assumptions. There's like a whole cloud of them that we're assuming, and we can unpack. So when we see somebody starting out with factual or descriptive language, and then we get to some sort of ethical prescription, instead of saying, "Oh, you derived an ought from an is," throw everything away. What we really ought to do is say, okay, what's being assumed here? Let's unpack it. Let's see. And then if we do that, then maybe some of them are actually not correct, right?
Right.
But if we don't make them explicit, we can't tell.
It's definitely the worst usage of this is to stop the conversation. It's like
right.
It's like it is what it is a thought terminating cliche, and so this is not quite there, but it is hey, let's just stop the conversation instead of going and digging in further.
Do you think when people use that catchphrase, it is what it is, it seems like it's a purely factual statement in even what we call a tautology, where you're just saying the same thing twice. But they don't usually mean it that way, right? They're usually like, you should accept this thing, or I will accept this thing, and not kick a fuss about it because it is what it is. So maybe it has some value or normative or ought content to it, even though it seems completely factual, right?
Right. And sometimes it's like a kind of a agree to disagree type of thing. It's like, hey, I don't want to have this conversation anymore. I don't want to investigate this anymore. So that's actually very useful for someone that's trying to, preserve an idea within their own head. And they don't want to investigate. If they don't investigate it, they don't have the chance to change their thinking. It's the
equivalent to like putting your fingers in your ears and just saying, no, right?
A little bit, yeah. And so, like, that's the worst use of, ought is, the chasm therein.
Yeah.
But, like, I think it's also useful to bring in a little bit of Immanuel Kant and hypothetical imperatives, because that's where we get, like, that's at least one way that we, jump this chasm. It's like, okay, yes, you have all the is, but you want those things. So, based on, like, I think it's good, or most people think it's good. That's why you get to these things. As we're talking about with these, this married couple, like, yes, they did this thing in part because they want to only be with each other, and they don't want them to be with anyone else. And that's kind of like the whole point of marriage in the first place. And if you're going to do that, it has usually has the built-in assumptions that they care about the things that they're signing up for.
Yeah. I'm laughing a little bit because I'm just remembering how Kant, when it comes to romance and sex and stuff like that, he's not the guy we want to go to, because if I remember rightly, he defined marriage as something like a contract between people to like give access to each other's bodies. I mean, you think, okay, well, I guess that's part of marriage in a way. I mean, I don't know that it's like a contract. You don't get, I mean, people back in the old days did talk about like marital right, and it actually went both ways too. If you wanted to have sex with your partner, you could be like, hey, marital right, you got to give me that at least, once a day or once a week or something like that. But I think at least I hope we've evolved beyond that societally, and we do view it more as an occasion for intimacy or something like that, So, yeah.
Yes, I don't want to go too far off of a tangent, but it's like, can marriage be a categorical imperative?
You mean getting married? That like everybody should get married?
Yeah, but if it's a categorical imperative,
I mean, if that's so, then Kant violated it, right? Because he didn't get married,
right?
I mean, Kind of. You would have to parse it in such a way, like if you do, and so this sounds like I'm making it hypothetical, but it's not. It's not really. If you do intend to have sex with somebody, then it should be within the bounds of whatever we want to call it, a legally ratified relationship, or, what we typically call marriage. So Kant would say, okay, imagine a universe in which this is the way everybody does behave. Do you run into any logical inconsistencies? And the answer would be no. I mean, being faithful within marriages, we could imagine a world where nobody ever cheats. That's not a problem. No. Even if they want to, right? They hold themselves back. And then you got to ask, is it something you would actually choose? And that's where it gets kind of dicey. I mean, Kant thinks that you should put aside all of your desires and inclinations. But what if you were very attractive and you were like, I don't know that I want to tie myself down just to one person, because I could easily, at this point in my life, until I get old and don't look good, play the field, right? So would any rational being automatically will that? I don't know. I mean, I suppose a Kantian would come along and say, well, it doesn't matter what your desires and inclinations are. But I mean, I think most of us do take those into account. Right?
Yeah. Yes. And that's why we, at least in part, have quite a bit of infidelity yet.
I mean, that seems to be a constant throughout history. Again, this was a little bit of a tangent.
Right.
I do a lot of reading of monastic literature, and not just Christian monastic literature, but also, in other cultures as well. And one of the things that you do see is that not all of them, and not even most of them, but monks and nuns certainly seem, at least in certain periods, to like sneaking out of their monasteries and convents to have illicit sexual relations with each other, which, might be more reflective of the fact that in a lot of cases, the people who became monks or nuns didn't really want to be monks or nuns. They just got stuck in a place like that,
You were the third son, therefore you must go into the priesthood or something.
Exactly. They actually made a distinction in Latin in the Middle Ages between two different sets of monks that would often be at odds with each other. And one, I think, were called the conversi, meaning the ones who'd chosen and converted. They were like, yeah, I don't want to be a soldier anymore. I want to be a monk. And then there were the oblati, and that means sacrifices. So these are the unfortunate kids, like you said, a third son. Well, you're not going to inherit anything. You're going to the church, So, and they often would kind of jockey within monasteries. The oblati would be like, we've been pure since we were kids. You conversi, you lived a worldly life. And then the conversi would be like, well, you didn't really choose to become a monk. Somebody just made that decision for you. We actually made a decision. And interestingly, Anselm's answer to this is, both of you are wrong. You shouldn't be fighting about this sort of thing. So,
what was his final answer there?
Well, it was one of those. They both are kind of right and kind of wrong. He didn't fall on the side of either, and he was a conversi.
Okay.
Again, a little bit of a digression here, but he did something. We don't know what it was. But he lost his virginity because he has a meditation on lost virginity, and probably had a good time while he was traveling around France for maybe 3 years or so after he left his home, before he decided to settle down and become a monk at Bec. He never tells us what he did, but presumably he had at least some good time doing it. Well, should we go on to the next one?
I was just trying to remember who's the quote, Lord, grant me chastity, but not yet.
St. Augustine.
Yes.
The saint that we can so easily relate to, a saint who is a great sinner. I mean, so again, a bit of a digression. I'd be curious to hear your point of view on this. And it doesn't have to be like religious saints. It could be moral exemplars other sorts. I find somebody like Augustine way more relatable than I do like Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas, he's a kid. He's got an uncle who's a Benedictine. He's like very, very religious. And the only thing that his family has a problem with is he doesn't want to be a nice Benedictine. He wants to go join those scummy friars that wander around and beg for money, the Dominicans, right? And so they try to, they lock him up under house arrest. His brothers, if I remember right, bring in a prostitute to try to seduce him, and he drives them off. And I don't find that all that relatable. If I were a teenager, I might have given in on that. And Augustine gave in an awful lot and lived a really rich life, but one that he found was there was something missing. There was something lacking. And he then converts really in middle age, you could say. So he knows plenty about sin because he's done plenty of them. So, I mean, what do you think about that sort of thing? An exemplar who's actually like, you could say, well, they're not pure. Maybe they're a bit hypocritical, but they've actually like screwed up a lot.
Yeah.
And now they're advocating for something different than that screwing up.
It's both like relatable, because almost all of us have screwed up, and like the only people that like, didn't were like the goody two shoes, and you didn't really want to be them in the first place. And it's kind of like the whole, you can study things your entire life, but how well do you actually know it if you don't experience it? This kind of brings up Hunter S. Thompson and his old like gonzo journalism. He thought like you had to actually go and join the Hells Angels for a while if you wanted to like really talk about the Hells Angels and really like first person.
That might
experience.
be going a little too far,
But regardless, I guess he didn't join them, but he rode with them for like a year or so. I'm not quite sure exactly how long, but regardless, it's definitely a trope that people love because this is like such a like great like either maybe not quite rags to riches, but like this I tried it this way, I thought it was good, but then I saw the light, and so you'll what's it called? People love this as like conversion stories. Think of like maybe another like thing is like Saul the tax collector and whatnot, and on the best
becomes Paul.
He sees the light, right? And so it is very enticing, and it, especially if you believe the things that they eventually came to also believe, then you feel like, oh yeah, like he did the same thing, or he could have done all these things, and he saw the folly of his ways, and it makes them feel good about your own choice in that regard.
Yeah.
Another example of this is like, think of like people who are like Amish and go on Rumspringa, right? They go to experience the world, and they like, okay, you have these two options. You can go and do the the modern thing, or you can go back to the the old Amish life or Mennonite, and you go and recommit yourself to this thing. I guess it's this whole idea of like you actually trying out firsthand a number of different examples and choosing for yourself the one that actually seems to work with experience instead of just like theory.
Yeah, I mean, this is not directly related to it, and I think I may have talked with you about this before, but I don't know if we've done it on the air. My wife Andy and I came up with a kind of principle that I think you could extend into all sorts of other things. And it was when she was essentially, mostly for health reasons, living like a vegan lifestyle as far as eating. And she would try out things and she'd be like, oh, this is so good. This tastes just like XYZ, or this is a really great dish. And then in some cases, I'd be like, no, that doesn't taste like beef at all. You've just not had beef for so long that you think that this actually tastes like beef. Or I'd be like, this actually, it doesn't taste that good. The spices don't work that well. And I forget exactly what we called it, but the basic idea was the people who are best qualified to say whether vegan food really is tasty and whether it tastes like something that's non-vegan cannot be the vegans. It has to be the people who are not pure, who are out there eating all sorts of things omnivorously. Those are the people that you got to ask. And so I think we could extend this into all sorts of other things as well. You don't want, so what's a great philosophical book? You don't just want to go to philosophy professors and ask them that. You want to ask some guy who only reads philosophy on the side, because he might actually be a better judge about what's enjoyable. I mean, professors, they've gotten too used to reading Kant all the time,
Yeah. Or Hegel.
Something like that. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I don't find Hegel enjoyable, but,
I thought it was like flogging for you, and just so you enjoy.
Well, I'm not into flagellation. So that would be one of those things too, where you ask a flagellant, "Hey, what's it like?" "Oh, it's amazing. You should try it." Right? And then you get like an average person and let them whip themselves a bit, and it probably only take like one stroke, and they'll be like, "Nope. I'm out."
Now the question is, what is the Platonic form of flagellation? Which is just a segue here to another one of these topics that gets misunderstood. That is the Platonic forms of a thing. And so it comes from, obviously, Plato. It's in the name. And it's the misrepresentation is that there are physical archetypes. The Platonic form is something we can actually encounter physically in the world. And this is like really outside of what Plato is actually writing about, that the idea is a pattern from that is most true and real, eternal, a unity in things of which is a form participant in it. We cannot experience a form through our senses, but only through the use of our higher faculties, through contemplation and dialectic. And so there's the Plato talks about the realm of the forms is not our physical realms, and these things, these our pencils and our chairs and tables and our D&D dice are mere reflections.
Well, those are Platonic solids.
They are. Well, most of them are. Yes. These are mere reflections into our physical space. And if you're kind of familiar with the ideas of what are they called, a hypercube, which is a 4D projection into 3D space, or maybe if you think of a circle is a 3D projection of a sphere onto a 2D plane as you're passing through it. And so they live outside of what we can physically interact with, and they're the ideal perfect things. Like you can never get a perfect cube, except for in the idea of a perfect cube.
Yeah. I think, and I could be wrong about this, in the ancient world, I don't think there was anybody who would say the Platonic form of X and think that it was an empirical experiential thing. I think that's kind of like a modern trope that comes about because people are being metaphorical and they want to, they want to say this is the Platonic form of coffee or the Platonic archetype of coffee because it's such a great coffee drink, right? Or, I don't know, they could talk about a person's athletic performance and they could be like, that person is the Platonic archetype of the shot putter. And I think the people who originally did that maybe were being tongue-in-cheek or just playing around with language. Well, and then other people didn't understand. And they were like, and I think this is what happened with a lot of the terms that we talked about last time too, like Epicurean or Stoic. People use the terminology and they know what it means, but they're using it in a kind of weird way. Other people reading them, they don't get that. And then it becomes part of the culture. So, I've seen people have articles about the Platonic form of a golf course. And you're like, well, no, that doesn't work. There aren't any Platonic forms of that. There could be a Platonic form of a golf club, I suppose. or I don't know, maybe a whole, but it wouldn't be something that you could actually go and buy and then use.
Yeah.
You know,
it's the whole idea of like chairness or golf clubness is like the things approach it, but because they're instantiated in the physical world, they can never be perfect.
You know, and it's interesting. In a lot of these cases, there couldn't be a perfect one because it's always so context dependent. So, like, take golf clubs. It's a great example because you got drivers, irons or wedges, and putters. And then maybe there's some other ones that I don't know about because I don't really play golf. And each of them has a certain function. And, you know, you get like a whole bag full of these because you need more than one of them for different activities. And so it's dependent to the context that you're within. There is no best golf club. Mm-hmm. You can't even say there's a best in terms of like material. It kind of depends on what you want to do with it, you know?
As well as continue on this golf analogy here, like what is the perfect golf course besides it having 18 holes
and grass? And
does grass even have to be it? Like, you know,
like could you have AstroTurf? You mean,
or some other material? Like, you know, yes, grass is usually the standard, but is that like the perfect thing? Does it always have to be that? And also like maybe some people are really like really long ones, or maybe people like lots of obstacles and having to be very precise with your placement. And it would be context dependent upon what the desires of that golfer is. Like, oh, I really like this type of challenge, and it might not be the cup of tea for someone else. Then how do you square that circle of these two competing desires of what they think is the best course?
Yeah, that's a great example, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Where, yeah.
I mean, I think there's a lot of things that you probably can't have a Platonic form of, even if Platonic forms do exist, which is a bit of an open question in philosophy, right? Admittedly.
Yeah. It's the realm of ideas, right?
I mean, I will say this real quick because we got to end soon. Maybe Platonism does make sense within mathematics. Mm-hmm. You know, maybe numbers are like Platonic forms. Mm-hmm. I know it's kind of popular among mathematicians, but I think when it comes to chairness, that's kind of a non-starter. I know.
So, with that, we should leave you today with the words of H.L. Mencken. Any man who afflicts the human race with ideas must be prepared to see them misunderstood.